This is not right. You are not listening to me. After everything, you just dismiss it like it's nothing. I demand to be heard.
There is a very specific kind of silence that follows a loud noise in a courtroom. It is not an empty silence. It is a heavy, holding your breath kind of silence filled with the collective anticipation of consequences. Over the decades I have spent presiding over this bench, I have heard many loud noises. I have heard the sharp crack of my own gavel, the shouts of denial, and the agonizing wails of those in grief. But the sound of a desperate, elderly man shouting at a bailiff over a worn-out cloth bag, that is a sound that reverberates with a different kind of pain. I am Judge Boyd. In this courtroom, I have learned that the law is often black and white, but the human condition is a vast sea of gray. My task is not just to maintain the statutes, but to listen to the stories that are hidden behind the anger and the confusion. It was a dreary, rain-soaked morning, the kind of day that makes the historic architecture of the courtroom feel a little colder and more imposing. The docket was filled with the usual tapestry of city life, expired registrations and minor traffic violations. The gallery was packed with people checking their watches, anxious to pay their fines and return to their lives. Then, the name Arthur Higgins was called. I watched him as he approached the podium. You can learn a great deal about a person by the way they walk toward the bench. Some bow their heads in shame, others strut with defiance. Arthur Higgins did neither. He marched with a frantic, cornered energy. He was in his late 70s, wearing a tweed jacket that was frayed at the elbows and trousers that seemed a bit too large for his fragile frame. But it was his eyes that caught my attention. They were wide, watery, and burning with a raw, unpolished fury. Before the charges could even be read, a compounding list of 6 unpaid parking tickets in a restricted medical zone, the tension snapped. The bailiff reached out to guide Arthur to the correct spot and asked him to place his old bag on the floor. "Don't you touch me," Arthur barked. His voice cracked with a frantic edge that filled every corner of the high-ceilinged room. "I know what this is. This whole building, this whole city. You just want to bleed me dry. You take any take until there is absolutely nothing left." The courtroom froze. The gallery went silent. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw the bailiff square his shoulders, preparing to restrain him. When a defendant exhibits this level of aggression, the protocol is swift. You submit, you restrain, and you hold them in contempt. But I raised my hand, palm flat, a silent gesture my staff knows well. Hold, let him be. I didn't look at his anger as an insult to the court. I looked at it as a protective mask. In the study of human behavior, I've learned that for the elderly, sudden aggression is rarely about malice. It is often a reaction to a world that is becoming increasingly unrecognizable. I looked at his hands. They were gripping the wooden podium so hard his knuckles were white. He was trembling, not from rage, but from a bone-deep exhaustion. "Mr. Higgins," I said, keeping my voice very quiet. I spoke softly enough that he had to lean in just a fraction of an inch to hear me. When someone is screaming, whispering is the most powerful tool you possess. It forces them to change their rhythm to meet yours. I am not here to take anything from you. I am here to understand why a man with a perfectly clean driving record for 40 years suddenly receives 6 tickets in the exact same spot over the last few months. The fire in Arthur's eyes began to flicker, replaced by a sudden, creeping uncertainty. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind the crushing weight of his reality. He looked down at his scuffed shoes, his jaw trembling. I don't know," he asserted, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I just had to get inside. They told me I couldn't park there, but I couldn't walk from the garage. It's too far. I had to get to her. She's waiting for me." I leaned back in my chair and put my glasses down. The air in the room shifts from confrontation to a heavy, shared curiosity. Who is waiting for you, Arthur? And why is she more important to you than the law? I reached out and opened Arthur's file. The paper feels heavy in my hands. In this room, a file is more than just a list of violations. It is a person's life reduced to ink and stamps. I looked at the history of the man standing before me. For 40 years, Arthur Higgins had been a ghost in the system. No speeding tickets, no missed court dates, not even a minor fender bender. He was the kind of citizen who followed the rules because the rules provided a sense of order. But then, The pattern shifted. Starting exactly 12 months ago, the clean slate was shattered. 6 parking tickets, all in the same restricted zone, all issued during the early hours of the morning or the late hours of the night. It was a dramatic, unexplained change in behavior. As a judge, when you see a sudden fracture in a long-standing habit, you don't look for a criminal intent. You look for the tragedy that caused the break. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the bench, and watched Arthur. The defiance he had shown moments ago was gone, replaced by a restless, fidgeting energy. He was plucking at a loose thread on his sleeve, his eyes darting toward the exit and then back to the old cloth bag he held so protectively. I noticed the dark, bruised exhaustion under his eyes, the kind of fatigue that sleep cannot fix. It is the exhaustion of someone who has forgotten what it feels like to rest. "Arthur," I said, my voice carries a paternal resonance. "I am looking at your record. You've been driving for nearly half a century without a single mark on your name. And then, suddenly, you become a regular in the restricted zone of the hospital. Why? A man doesn't risk his savings and his reputation for a parking spot unless he feels he has no other choice. Talk to me, Arthur. Who is waiting for you behind those hospital doors?" The silence stretched between us, absorbing the hum of the air conditioner and the distant sound of city traffic outside. Arthur swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his thin throat. When he finally spoke, his voice was no longer a shout. It was a fragile thread of sound that seemed ready to snap at any moment. "It's my wife, Judge," he whispered. "Martha. We've been married for 50 years. 50 years, 2 months, and 4 days. He stopped, as if surprised by his own precision. "But she doesn't always remember that anymore. The doctors say it's her heart, but it's more than that. Her mind is like a house where the lights are going out one by one, and I'm just trying to stay in the room with her before it goes completely dark." I felt a quiet shift in the courtroom. The gallery, which had been restless, became still. Even the bailiff, who had been standing guard, softened his stance. We weren't looking at an angry driver anymore. We were looking at a man who was fighting a war against time and biology. Arthur continued, his words coming faster now, driven by a desperate need to be understood. "The tickets, Judge. I know they're there. I see them on the windshield. But when I get to that hospital, my heart starts racing. I can't find a spot in the garage, and the walk is too long. If I'm 10 minutes late, she gets scared. She wakes up and looks for me, and if I'm not there, she thinks I've left her. I can't let her feel like she's alone, not after 50 years. I just park where I can, because getting to her side is the only thing that matters. Nothing else makes sense anymore." He looked up at me then, his eyes shining with unshed tears. The anger was entirely gone, leaving behind a jagged, raw vulnerability that hit harder than any outburst. He wasn't asking for mercy. He was simply explaining his reality, a reality where the law of the city had become an obstacle to the law of his heart. The courtroom remains hushed, the kind of stillness that occurs when people realize they are witnessing a private sanctuary being opened. I looked at Arthur, and I didn't see a defendant. I saw a man who had spent the last 5 decades building a life with someone, only to watch the foundation of that life crumble bit by bit every single morning. 50 years, I repeated softly. The words felt heavy in the air. That is more than a marriage, Arthur. That is a lifetime of shared secrets, thousands of morning coffees, and a million silent understandings. Tell me, what is it like for you now? When you wake up, does she know it's you? Arthur's hands, which had been clutching the podium, finally relaxed, but they began to tremble. He looked past me, staring at a point on the wall, as if he were watching a movie of his own life playing out. "Some mornings are okay, Judge," he said, his voice regaining a bit of its strength but laced with a profound sadness. "She'll look at me and smile that specific way she has, the way that tells me she's still in there. But those moments are getting shorter. Most days now, I'm a stranger who knows exactly how she likes her toast. I'm a ghost haunting my own house. I spend my hours making sure she's safe, making sure she takes the pills that keep her heart beating, even if her mind has already started to leave." I watched him closely as he spoke. In my years of judging, I've learned to read the body as much as the testimony. I saw the frayed edges of his shirt collar and the way he had missed a button. This wasn't the sloppiness of a man who didn't care. It was the mark of a man who had no time left for himself because every second was dedicated to someone else's survival. The tickets, Arthur, I said, bringing him back to the legal matter, but with a tone of deep empathy. Tell me about the morning you got the most recent one. Walk me through it. Arthur took a shaky breath. It was Tuesday. It was raining, just like today. Martha had a bad night. She kept calling out for her mother, who's been gone 20 years. By the time I got her dressed and to the clinic for her treatment, we were late. The garage was full. The sign said, "No parking." But Martha was starting to panic in the back seat. She didn't know where she was. She started crying, reaching for the door handle while the car was still moving. I had to stop. I had to get her inside where she was. She felt safe. I didn't care about the ticket. I just needed to hold her hand and tell her it was okay, even if I wasn't sure it was. As he spoke, I could see the audience in the gallery leaning in. There were heads nodding, people who perhaps were caring for an aging parent or a sick spouse. Arthur wasn't just speaking for himself. He was the voice of every silent caregiver in this city. He was a man running on empty, fueled only by a sense of duty and a love that refused to quit. I leaned back, steeped my fingers, and looked at the prosecutor. I saw him close his laptop. He knew, as I did, that the law was never intended to punish a man for his devotion. "You're carrying a heavy cross, Arthur," I said. "A man working as hard as you are doesn't have the luxury of worrying about a yellow envelope on his windshield. But the city sees a violation. I see a man who is exhausted to his very marrow." I picked up my pen, not to sign a judgment, but to hold something steady in my hand as I processed what I was hearing. In this room, we are often told that justice is blind, that it should not see the person, only the deed. But as I sat there looking at Arthur, I realized that blind justice is sometimes just another name for cruelty. If I do not see the man, if I do not see the 50 years of loyalty etched into his tired face, then I am not a judge, I am merely a machine. I looked down at the 6 yellow slips of paper spread across my bench. To the city's computer system, these are just outstanding debts. They are revenue to be collected, a balance to be settled. But to the man standing before me, these tickets are the weight of a world that is slowly closing in on him. Every fine is another hour he has to work, another stress he doesn't need, and another moment taken away from Martha. Arthur, you mentioned that you've been married for 50 years. In a world where people give up on each other so easily, that is a sacred thing. You are not just a husband, you are a guardian at the gates, trying to hold back the shadows for the woman you love. That is the most honorable work a man can do. I noticed a small, jagged movement in Arthur's shoulders, a sob he was trying to suppress. He wiped his eyes with the back of a called hand. I've seen that hand before. It's the hand of the generation that built this country hardworking, quiet, and fiercely independent. These are men who don't ask for help until the water is already over their heads. The law says you parked in a restricted zone, I continued, my voice steady and warm. And the law is there for a reason, to make sure ambulances can get through, to keep order in a busy city. But there's a principle that stands higher even than the letter of the law, and that is mercy. Without mercy, the law is nothing but a cold, unfeeling blade that cuts everyone to the same size. And I refuse to let it cut you, Arthur. I looked over at the bailiff and then at the clerk. They've seen me do this before, yet the room felt different today. There was a sense of shared gravity, a realization that we were all just one diagnosis or one tragedy away from being in Arthur's shoes. "You told me you were angry when you walked in here," I said softly. "You shouted at my staff. You felt like the world was bleeding you dry. And looking at your situation, Arthur, I can't say I blame you. Anger is often just the sound a heart makes when it's being crushed by a burden it was never meant to carry alone. You aren't a criminal, Arthur. You are a hero who is simply running on empty." I watched as the tension finally began to drain from his face, replaced by a look of total, unvarnished relief. For the first time since he entered the room, he wasn't bracing himself for a blow. He was finally being seen. The courtroom seemed to shrink in that moment. The space between Arthur and me was no longer a divide between a judge and a defendant. It had become a sanctuary for a conversation about the true meaning of devotion. My eyes were drawn back to the old cloth bag Arthur had been clutching so desperately. It was a faded blue, the fabric worn thin by years of use, the straps frayed and held together by clumsy, hand-stitched repairs, stitches likely made by Arthur's own trembling hands. Earlier, when the bailiff had asked him to set it down, Arthur had exploded in a fit of protective rage. Now that the anger had evaporated, he held it against his chest as if it were the last life jacket on a sinking ship. "Arthur," I said, my voice low and filled with genuine concern. "I couldn't help but notice that bag you're holding. Earlier, you were so protective of it, even willing to fight my staff to keep it close. May I ask what's inside that is so precious to you?" Arthur looked down at the bag, his thin, age-spotted fingers tracing the rough texture of the fabric. He let out a long sigh, a breath that seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 sleepless nights. "In here is Martha's entire world, Your Honor," he said softly, his voice trembling like a leaf in the wind. "It holds her medication and the purple wool scarf she loves because the hospital waiting rooms are always so cold. And it holds our history." He hesitated for a moment, then reached in and pulled out a small, yellowed photograph. Martha sometimes looks in the mirror and doesn't recognize the woman staring back at her. She becomes terrified of her own reflection. But when I show her these pictures, when I tell her the story of how we met at that little diner under the rain 50 years ago, sometimes, just for a second, her eyes light up again. She calls my name. I can't leave this bag anywhere else. If I lose it, I'm afraid I'll lose the last thread connecting Martha to this reality. I sat in silence. The entire courtroom was still, caught in a wave of collective emotion. In a world of cold statutes and rigid decrees, we often forget that every violation has a heartbeat behind it. That cloth bag wasn't just an object. It was a vessel for love, hope, and the desperate effort of a man trying to catch the falling pieces of a half-century marriage. The 6 parking tickets spread before me weren't proof of a man who didn't care about the law. They were the price he was willing to pay to ensure he was never a second late when Martha needed him. He didn't park illegally out of laziness. He parked there because he was in a race against his wife's fading memory. Every minute spent walking from a distant garage was a minute lost, a minute he might have used to see Martha while she still knew who he was. "Arthur," I said, feeling a profound sense of empathy. "The world looks at you and sees a forgetful senior, a troublemaker in a courtroom, but I sit here and I see a hero. You are fighting a battle that none of us can truly imagine. You are carrying a load that would break the back of a man half your age." I realized then that Arthur's forgetfulness, his failure to see the no parking signs, his inability to track the mounting fines wasn't a sign of a failing mind. It was the result of an overflowing heart. When your mind is entirely consumed by the image of a person who is slowly disappearing, there is simply no room left for the trivial rules of a city. The courtroom remains so still that you can hear the faint, rhythmic ticking of the clock on the back wall. It was a sound I rarely noticed in the chaos of a busy morning, but in that moment, it felt like the heartbeat of the room. I looked at the 6 tickets again. To the computer systems at City Hall, these are just numbers, unpaid debts that trigger late fees and potential warrants. But as I sat in this chair, looking at the man who had just shared his soul with us, I saw those yellow slips for what they truly were, the crushing weight of a life that was slowly collapsing under its own gravity. I looked at the prosecutor, whose expression had shifted from professional detachment to something much more thoughtful. He quietly closed his folder, a silent acknowledgement that the letter of the law had no place in the presence of such a monumental sacrifice. I then turned my attention back to Arthur. He stood there, his shoulders slumped, his eyes fixed on his scuffed shoes, waiting for the hammer to fall. He was a man who had been braced for impact his entire life, and he expected nothing less from me. "Arthur," I began, my voice steady and carrying the weight of the office I hold. "You came in here today and you yelled at my staff. You were angry, you were defensive, and you were ready for a fight. And if I were to judge you strictly by those 10 seconds of frustration, the law would allow me to detain you. I could hold you in contempt. I could add more fines to your burden. That is what the code says I should do." I saw him flinch slightly, his hand tightening around the strap of his blue bag. But I continued, softening my tone. But I have been a judge for a very long time, Arthur, and I know the difference between a man who has no respect for the law and a man who has simply reached the absolute end of his rope. You haven't been driving recklessly for the thrill of it. You haven't been parking in restricted zones because you think you're above the rules. You've been doing it because you are drowning, and you're trying to keep Martha's head above the water while you go under. I picked up my pen and looked at the primary citation, the one that started this entire morning. The law is a set of boundaries we all agree to, so that we don't hurt one another. We have speed limits to keep our streets safe. We have parking regulations to keep our hospitals accessible. But above every law, there is a higher principle. That principle is mercy. Without it, justice is just a cold, unfeeling machine. And I refuse to be a machine. I took a deep breath, looking him squarely in the eyes. Arthur, I have a responsibility to the citizens of this city, but I also have a responsibility to the human being standing in front of me. I see a man who has lost his partner to a cruel disease while she is still sitting right next to him. I see a man who is working 24 hours a day as a nurse, a driver, a cook, and a guardian, all for the woman he promised to love 50 years ago. I made a few precise strokes with my pen across the top of his file. I am going to dismiss these charges, I said, my voice firm and authoritative. Every single one of them. The fines are gone. The late fees are gone. The points on your record are wiped clean. Today, Arthur, the slate is balanced. Arthur looked up at me, his mouth slightly parted in disbelief. For a moment, he didn't move. He didn't speak. It was as if he was waiting for someone to tell him it was a mistake, that the world wasn't actually capable of such kindness. The silence that followed the dismissal was different from the silence of anticipation. It was a soft, collective exhale. I watched Arthur's face. The lines of tension didn't just fade, they seemed to dissolve, leaving him looking suddenly very old and very tired. He stood there for a long moment, blinking as if he were waking up from a nightmare. You're dismissing them? All of them? He whined, his voice shaking. Every single one, Arthur, I said, leaning back in my chair, my expression becoming more serious. But I am not doing it because your actions were correct. You were parking illegal. You were putting yourself and others in danger. I am doing it because I believe you are a man of character who has been pushed to the absolute brink of human endurance. I am doing it because the law was never meant to be a blade that cuts down a man who is already on his knees. I leaned forward again, my eyes locked onto him. This is the moment where I stopped being a judge and started being a brother, a son, a fellow traveler. But Arthur, listen to me carefully. This is the part you cannot forget. Martha needs you. She doesn't need a husband who is risking his life on the road because he's blinded by exhaustion. She doesn't need a husband who is arrested or injured because he was rushing. If you are not safe, Arthur, then Martha is not safe. I noticed the way he flinched at the mention of her safety. It's the human reading I mentioned. When you touch a person's true north, they cannot hide their reaction. You've been running on empty for too long, I continued. You think that by sacrificing every ounce of your own peace, you are saving her. But you are like a pilot trying to fly a plane with no fuel. Eventually, the engine stops. You need to find a way to breathe. You need to ask for help, because the only thing worse than the burden you are carrying is the danger of letting it drop. You are her everything, Arthur. Don't let your devotion become the thing that destroys the safety you've worked 50 years to build. I looked out at the gallery. I saw people wiping their eyes. I saw a young man in the back row sitting up a little straighter. This lesson wasn't just for Arthur. It was for every person in that room who thought they had to suffer in silence to prove their love. The world is quick to call a man reckless when they see him speeding, I said to the room at large. We are quick to judge the anger of the elderly or the frustration of the weary, but we rarely stop to ask, who are you running towards? If we could only pause to listen before we pass our final judgment, we might find that the person standing across from us is not an adversary, but a hero who has simply run out of strength. I turned back to Arthur and gave him a small, respectful nod. You have a clean slate, Arthur. Now go back to her. Give her a hug for me. And tell her that she has a man who loves her enough to keep himself safe, just so he can be there to hold her hand tomorrow. As the heavy wooden doors of the courtroom swung shut behind Arthur Higgins, the sound echoed through the hall, not with the finality of a prison cell, but with the soft, resonant click of a new beginning. I watched him through the glass panes for a moment. He didn't walk with the hurry, desperate march he had used to enter the room. He walked with a quiet, measured tread, like a man who had finally been allowed to set down a suitcase he had been forced to carry for miles. The courtroom was buzzing with a soft, collective hum, the sound of relief, or perhaps simply the acknowledgement that something honest and human had just occurred. I picked up my pen and, with a few precise strokes, marked the citations as dismissed. I noted the extraordinary and extenuating circumstances, but no ink on paper could truly capture the weight of what had transpired. I leaned back in my leather chair, allowing the silence of the room to wash over me. The next case on the docket was a routine matter involving an expired registration, but for a moment, I stayed with the memory of Arthur and Martha. You see, in this building, we are tasked with upholding the law, but the law is not meant to be a blade that cuts everyone to the same size. It is meant to be a bridge, helping us navigate the complexities of our shared lives. When you sit in this chair, you realize that people don't usually break the rules because they are inherently bad. They break them because life has a way of backing them into a corner until the only exit they see is a forbidden one. My father used to tell me that the true measure of a man is not how he handles his success, but how he carries his cross. Arthur Miller was carrying a cross that would have bent a lesser man double. He did it for Martha. He did it in a state of absolute, bone-deep exhaustion. I looked up as the inspector approached the bench with the next set of files. He gave me a small, respectful nod, a flicker of appreciation for the grace of a second chance. "Everything in order, Inspector?" I asked, my voice steady, the calm of the courtroom restored. "Everything is in order, Judge," he replied quietly. As the afternoon wore on and the golden shadows of the setting sun began to stretch across the floorboards, I thought about the millions of Arthurs out there, people running on empty, fighting invisible battles, and feeling like the world is only interested in their mistakes. If we could only pause for a moment, if we could only listen before we pass our final judgment, we might find that the world is a much more fragile and much more beautiful place than we imagine. We might find that the person standing across from us is not an adversary to be conquered, but a fellow traveler in need of a little compassion. I have been a judge for many years, and I have made many decisions, some easy, some agonizingly difficult, but I have never once regretted an act of mercy. At the end of the day, we are all just trying to get home to the ones we love. And if I can help just one person find their way there a little bit easier, then my time on this bench has been worth every second. The case of Arthur Higgins is closed, but the lesson of his devotion remains. Now, it is time to prepare for tomorrow, because tomorrow there will be more stories, more lives, and more chances to see the human being behind the file.